All right. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Beam. I'm Managing Director of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. That's probably a little better. I'm happy to welcome you all to this event. Those of you here in Foster Auditorium and those smart ones of you who are warm and dry in your homes watching online. Let me also thank Andrew Dudash, the social science library here at the librarian here at the University Libraries, and Andrew Sears, who's Dean of the College of Information Sciences and Technologies. They're both co-sponsoring this event with us. Let me also just say, as is our wont, our own Jenna Spinelli is going to be doing the Q&A afterwards, and that'll be online and here in the auditorium as well. So our guest, Peter Pomerantsev, co-directs the ARENA initiative, which is part of the NSF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. I think I got that all right. The ARENA Institute works on issues of misinformation, especially online, and it looks for ways to kind of mitigate some of the negative effects of that misinformation. And we at the McCourtney Institute think pretty highly of this work, and we even invited him on the Democracy Works podcast to talk about it. And after we invited him, we found out that the Ukrainian Studies program here at Penn State also invited him. And we worked together and we figured out when to bring him in and how to bring him in. So Mr. Pomerantsev will be doing a second lecture tomorrow at 3:30 in room 110 at the Business Building. And the title of that talk is Russian Propaganda in War-Torn Ukraine. So I'm expecting that many of you in this room know that that area of the world is also part of his expertise. But the important point, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that I think these efforts are united. They are both driven by Pomerantsev's fierce defense of the truth and his lifelong fight against lies, misinformation, and propaganda. His interest in misinformation on social media began with his experience dealing with Russian propaganda. He was born in Kiev, and after his father was arrested, I think he's going to reference this story, so he'll tell you more about it. But after his family was forced to emigrate to Western Europe and eventually ended up in England, he returned to Russia and worked there for 10 years up until 2010. And his first book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, it's an excellent book, by the way, reflects on that experience. And his new book, This Is Not Propaganda, which he will discuss today, is also an excellent book. And it, again, takes on this contemporary age of disinformation, not just here, but all over the world. In my humble estimation, Pomerantsev is this era's Hannah Arendt. Someone who has seen for themselves how lies can be weaponized. Yeah, I know, that's a really high bar. I thought I should probably maybe clear that with you, but it's true.
I've actually had Martha Gellhorn before.
Oh, yeah?
Arendt's like scary.
It is. Your writing is a lot clearer, actually, but or a lot more accessible, I should say. But stick with me because I think I'm right.
I might let you know, the Wikipedia.
Maybe, but that's still pretty damn good in my book. Anyway, someone who has seen for themselves how lies can be weaponized, seen their corrosive power, seen what they can do to human beings, to society, and especially to democracy. And both understand that fighting for the truth is integral to a fight for democracy. So that work, I think, unites everything he does, both from the work at the ARENA Institute, in his books, and his many public writings as well. And I just want to close by saying it's relevant that Peter just returned from Ukraine, from Kyiv. And I see that as yet another manifestation of his commitment and just how seriously he takes it. So with that,
Tweeting stuff about Hannah Arendt.
so I'm done. Please join me in welcoming Peter Pomerantz to Penn State.
Tell me where I can charge my phone. It's about to die, and I've got lots of calls afterwards that I need to take straight away. Is that it? It's not that easy. I've been looking around for a plug. Is there a plug in this room? There isn't one there though. No? Yeah? Okay, good. We're good. All right. Thank you. Great. Sorry about this. My phone is at that stage of its life where it starts dying really quickly. Even though on the border when I crossed into Ukraine, you know, obviously I fit suspicious kind of gender and age, and I was on my own. The Ukrainian secret services took my phone for an hour, and since then it's been dying very quickly. But like, fair enough. There's a war on. You get spied on. That's okay, I suppose. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, which I'm slightly reeling from, but I'll try to live up to the billing. You mentioned a bit about my background. I've just come back from Ukraine. I'd love to talk about that more if you have questions. That's not the immediate subject of my talk today, but will be tomorrow, I think. Though obviously it'll creep into the content today as well. I mean, the thing to understand about me, why I'm really not like Hannah Arendt, is that I've ended up in university by accident. I kind of fell into it after years and years and years of being a journalist and director, basically. I was making documentaries after university. I made entertainment shows. I wrote books. I make radio programs still, kind of across all the genres, largely sort of focusing on non-fiction narrative storytelling, whether it's for video or radio or audio or in books. But at one point, I basically found that the truth wasn't getting through, and that I might be sort of very happy with what I've written or put together, and I might be getting awards for it, and everything is going swimmingly, and I go to parties in North London and I don't know, the Upper West Side, and everything's great, but actually I'm in a bubble. And it's a systemic crisis that me and all my friends, we're all in a bubble and we're not doing anything to get out of it. And that's something I noticed working in Russia, which I did in the early 2000s. Putin was quite happy for the liberal intelligentsia to sit in our little bubble, complaining, talking about Hannah Arendt. He didn't care. He was quite happy to frame us there, call us enemies of the people, call us liberal elites, and make the rest of the country hate us. And obviously we see that here. So my turn to academia was really a turn understanding that I need a space where I can research how we get out of that bubble, which I think is the great sort of challenge of our times for what I do. I mean, obviously there's other bigger ones, so that's how I've ended up at Johns Hopkins. I was at the LSE before, and the work we do is very, very practical. We kind of work with sociologists and journalists. We put them together, and we find ways to sort of reach audiences who don't believe in the truth, or don't believe in our truth, or who are beholden to conspiracy theories, or who just doubt everything. And that's the work that we're doing. So that's kind of who I am, and why I'm now sort of semi-respectable, quasi-academic, and not just a sort of dodgy journalist. But it's all about the journalism, really. So I suppose that's the theme of my talk today. I like to call this talk the structural disintegration of the public sphere, which somebody will get that joke. Nobody else? No, nobody got the joke. Fine. It's a Habermas joke. Doesn't matter. You don't have to get the Habermas jokes. But it's really about that. It's the crisis that I ended up sort of confronting, which started off with this feeling that I can't reach audiences that I need to reach, and the audiences that I'm reaching already agree with me. And as I thought about this more and more and more, I realized that it is a structural issue, that there is something fundamental that we don't understand in the connection between information and democracy. We have all these kind of assumptions that I'm going to talk about today, about how it's meant to work, and it doesn't. And what we really need to do is to really rethink our vision of a democratic public sphere. What do we even mean by a public sphere? What do we mean by democratic discourse? How is this cacophony of shouting, screaming, arguing actually meant to create an efficient society? I mean, it's very, very clear to me that the claims that Vladimir Putin is making and the claims that Xi Jinping is making is that democracy does not work in the 21st century. Their claim is pretty specific. They're saying you got away with it in the 20th century, only dictatorship in the 21st century. It's too messy. It doesn't work in an information-rich environment. You can't adapt to the 21st century. 21st century will be about collecting data, centralizing data, dictating society from the center. It's stated pretty clearly in all their doctrines. And I don't think we've really started thinking through the challenge that they're giving us. But anyway, that's the theme. What I'm going to do, though, is read a little bit from my last book for two reasons. First, so you kind of understand the sort of writing I do and where I'm from, because it's narrative. And I don't want you to get this sort of like weird idea that I'm coming at all this from a purely, I don't know, political science or media and comms point of view. I'm very much a storyteller, so I wanted to give you a sense of the sort of stuff I do, just so you understand me better. But also because in order to make sense of the present, I found in my last book I had to go back to the past. What was our old idea of a democratic public sphere? And what's gone wrong? And I ended up doing that in my last book through the story of my parents. It's not a memoir in any kind of classic way. I use my parents' story in a very, very specific way in the book to reveal these larger issues. I'm English, so I'm quite squeamish about sort of personal narratives. I find American dinner parties really hard to deal with. And I've messed up quite a few already because they're like, so Peter, tell us about your story. Like, oh, God, that's so vulgar. But it's okay, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. So this is right from the start of my second book. And it sort of talks about my father's misadventures with the KGB. So I'll read a little bit. Don't worry, I'm not going to do one of these lectures where I just sort of stand like this reading. But I think it's important. He came out of the sea and was arrested on the beach. Two men in suits standing over his clothes as he returned from his swim. They ordered him to get dressed quickly, pull his trousers over his wet trunks. On the drive, the trunks were still wet, shrinking, turning cold, leaving a damp patch on his trousers and the back seat. He had to keep them on during the interrogation. There he was, trying to keep up a dignified facade, but all the time, the dank trunks made him squirm. It struck him they had done it on purpose. They were well versed in this sort of thing, these mid-ranking KGB men, masters of the small-time humiliation, the micro-mind game. Why had they arrested him here, he wondered, in Odessa, not where he lived in Kiev? Then he realized they wanted a few days by the seaside. In between interrogations, they would take him to the beach to go swimming themselves. One would sit while the other would bathe. It was August. One time an artist took out an easel and began to paint the three of them. The colonel and major grew nervous. They were KGB, and they weren't meant to have their images recorded during an operation. Go have a look at what he's drawing, they ordered their prisoner. He went over and had a look. Now it was his turn to mess with them a little. He's not drawn a good likeness of me, but you're coming out very true to life. He had been detained for distributing copies of harmful literature to friends and acquaintances, books censored for telling the truth about the Soviet Gulag, or for being written by exiles. When one interrogator would leave, the other would pull out a book of chess puzzles and solve them, chewing on the end of a pencil. At first, the prisoner wondered if this was some sort of clever mind game. Then he realized the man was just lazy, killing time at work. After 6 days, he was permitted to go back to Kiev, but the investigation continued. On the way from work, at the library, the black car would pull up and take him for more interrogations. During that time, life went on. His fiancée conceived, they married. At the back of the reception lurked a KGB photographer. He moved in with his wife's family in a flat opposite the Golosievsky Park, where his father-in-law had put up a palace of cages for his dozens of canaries, an aviary of throbbing feathers basking against the backdrop of the park. Every time the doorbell rang, he would start, scared it was the KGB, and would begin burning anything incriminating. Letters, articles, lists of arrests. The canaries would beat their wings in a panic-stricken flutter. Each morning, he rose at dawn, gently turned the Spadola radio to on, pushed the dial to shortwave, wiggled, waved the antenna to dispel the fog of jamming, climbed on chairs and tables to get the best reception, steering the dial in an acoustic slalom between transmissions of East German pop and Soviet military bands, pressing his ear tight to the speaker, and through the hiss and crackle, making his way to the magical words, "This is London, this is Washington." He was listening for news about arrests. The net closed around his circle. Grisha was taken to the woods and roughed up. Olga was accused of being a prostitute and, to make the point, was locked up in a VD clinic with actual prostitutes. Geli was taken to remand prison and refused treatment for so long that he went and died. Everyone prepared for the worst. His mother-in-law taught him a secret code based on sausages. If I bring sausages sliced right to left, it means we've been able to get out news of your arrest to the West, and it's been broadcast on the radio. If I slice them left to right, it means we failed. It sounds like something out of an old joke or a bad film, but it's nevertheless true, he would write later. When the KGB come at dawn and you mumble drowsily, "Who's there?" they often shout, "Telegram." You proceed in semi-sleep, trying not to wake up too much so you can still go back to a snug dream. "One moment," you moan. Pull on the nearest trousers, dig out some change to pay the messenger, open the door. And the most painful part is not that they have come for you or that they have got you up so early, but that you, like some small boy, fell for the lie about delivering a telegram. You squeeze in your hot palm the suddenly sweaty change, holding back tears of humiliation. At 8 a.m. on 30th September 1977, in between interrogations, their child was born. My grandmother wanted me to be called Pinchas after her grandfather. My parents wanted Theodore. I ended up being named Pyotr, the first of several renegotiations of my name. 40 years have passed since my parents were pursued by the KGB for the simple right to read, to write, to listen to what they chose to, and say what they wanted. Today, the world they hoped for, in which censorship would fall like the Berlin Wall, can seem much closer. We live in what academics call an era of information abundance. But the assumptions that underlay the struggles for rights and freedoms in the 20th century, between citizens armed with truth and information and regimes with their censors and secret police, have been turned upside down. We now have more information than ever before, but it hasn't brought only the benefits we expected. More information was supposed to mean more freedom to stand up to the powerful, but it's also given them new ways to crush and silence dissent. More information was supposed to mean a more informed debate, but we seem less capable of deliberation than ever. More information was supposed to mean mutual understanding across borders, but it's also made possible new and more subtle forms of conflict and subversion. We live in a world of mass persuasion run amok, where the means of manipulation have gone forth and multiplied. A world of dark ads, psyops, hacks, bots, soft facts, deepfakes, fake news, Putin, trolls, and Trump. So, as I say, you'll have to read the book to find out what happened to my parents. But the reason I sort of start the book off, or had to start the book off with my parents' story, was because it was a way of getting at the assumptions that we always had about the connection between democracy and information. So, interwoven in that, hopefully reasonably interesting story, is kind of what my parents were fighting for, which is a kind of compressed version of how we thought a democratic public sphere should be. So obviously they're fighting against censorship. That was always the great fight. You had nasty dictators on one hand, trying to suppress information, trying to censor people, shut them up, take away their printing presses. And you had critics and pro-democracy activists trying to express themselves. So it was censorship versus self-expression. And all the great kind of foundational documents around freedom of expression are really about that. It's about the freedom to express yourself. Yeah? Article 19 of the Declaration of Human Rights is all about the right to express and receive information. But there's also other stuff sort of wrapped up in that little story. So my father listening to the radio, he's living in a world in the Soviet Union where there's I don't know, people will correct me, but a very limited number of TV channels and radios and newspapers, all of which are state controlled. So there's this real desire to get other sources of information. And the shortwave radio becomes, your sort of like, I don't know, like a space traveling thing that can take you somewhere else. And also I think an idea of self-expression, which is, I have a lot more of that in the book as I work through it. My father was, apart from a writer, he was a poet, and he would write this very, very sort of self-expressive, somewhat indulgent poetry, all about his own feelings and how he felt, very romantic. But that was kind of an act of resistance in a culture where you weren't meant to have too many of your own feelings, where the self was subjugated to the state, and any feelings you're meant to have were about building a great socialist society. You're not meant to indulge in individualism that way. And I think we've always had that, this idea that self-expression leads to emancipation. So whether it's rock and roll or jazz, the more free you are, the more powerful you are in some ways. But in the information environment we live in today, that seems to have been turned upside down. So, and I'll be telling a bunch of stories about this today, but information is now used not just to sort of like enhance the public debate, but quite the opposite, to cause chaos, to shut people up by enveloping them in negative information, to flood the zone with shit, to sort of quote Steve Bannon. That's more information. That's not restricting information, that's overloading the information environment. Pluralism was meant to lead to better debate, but we can see, I think especially in America, an environment where pluralism leads to polarization that's so vicious that democratic debate breaks down, and that's China's argument about America. Look at it. They just row amongst each other. They're incapable of making policy, even when it would be good for them. But even this connection between kind of self-expression and emancipation, I think, has been broken. The more you express yourself on Facebook, the more you talk about yourself on social media, the more that's transmuted into data and given to advertisers or political propagandists to then influence you in ways that you may not even be aware of. So I'm not saying that the old problems of censorship don't exist. They do. In North Korea, increasingly in contemporary Russia. But the assumptions we had about the good have turned out to be much weaker than we thought. And perhaps wrapped up in all of that is probably the central problem. The fact that the Soviet government were arresting people for books which told the truth about the Soviet Union shows that they respected the truth. They were scared of the truth. They tried to suppress the truth. People fought for the truth. People tried to get the truth out. There was some sort of idea, and this may be the most important idea in democracies, that you could hold the powerful accountable with the truth. You know, the truth was like a crucifix that you put up to a Dracula, and they go, "Oh my God, the truth!" and sort of wilt when you saw it. Now that seems to have completely disappeared. We have a generation of leaders in democracies and non-democracies who really don't care about the truth. So the book, my last book, is an attempt to tease out what happened. How did we get to this place? And it's an attempt by trying to try to understand how we got to this place, to then think, what do we do about it? And maybe that's the conversation we can have in the Q&A, like what is the good that we want to achieve? So some of the reasons are technological. In the book, I tell the story of Maria Ressa. Do you all know who Maria Ressa is? You should by now. When I wrote about her, not very many people knew about her outside this journalistic community. Now she won the Nobel Peace Prize a few months ago. But it's a very, very good story in the sense that it really, really boils down so many of the dynamics. Any Philippines experts here? Hmm? Good. It's always really dangerous. Talking to a room full of, like, on Russia and Ukraine, I'm comfortable. The minute I start talking about South Asia, I'm like, oh no, well they know I don't really know what I'm talking about. What happened? Oh, sorry. So the Philippines, why is the Philippines important to understand all these things I've been talking about? 2 reasons. And why the first chapter of the book is in the Philippines, and there's a lot of intentionality there about why I started in the Philippines. Or I go from my parents to the Philippines. When we think about the process of dictatorship to democracy, when we think about, the myth of 1989, which is the great moment for many of us when you have this huge victory of democracies over dictatorship, freedom of expression over censorship, pluralism over one media, the whole bundle of values. We usually place that in Eastern Europe, as the epicenter, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the liberation of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and then the Baltic states. But it was happening everywhere. At the same time, you have this sort of pro-democracy wave in Latin America, sort of in the 80s and in the 90s, in South Africa, a little bit later, and in South Asia. And in many ways, I feel that the first great people-powered revolution of that period is in the Philippines, in Manila, in 1986, I think, when you have this huge people-powered revolution against the military dictator Marcos, who was US-backed. So this isn't even about Soviet Union versus US, it's about democracy versus dictatorship. Maria Ressa came to covering the Philippines a little bit later as a journalist. But the story she was trying to tell about South Asia, and she became the head of the CNN bureau in South Asia, was really about a region transforming from dictatorship to democracy. The Philippines was first, and then other countries followed. And then she went on, she was Filipino-American. She became very romantic about the Philippines, very romantic about the process, the potential of the internet to democratize societies, and she created this very, very successful online news site called Rappler in the Philippines. Full of the enthusiasm that people had about the internet at that time. It's meant to be a new kind of news resource where people contributed their own stories, where they shared their needs and journalists would respond. I mean, almost the news as a social service and a community that helped each other out as well as providing good information. The whole idea of the wisdom of crowds through the internet. And really their kind of, Rappler's success was really predicated on the rise of a new politician called Rodrigo Duterte, who was an outsider politician, so he wasn't on TV as much as he would want to be, but he wanted to run for president. And so he was one of the first to be kind of a Facebook candidate in the Philippines. And Rappler would do these online debates, and he would be the only senior politician running for president that would come. And they had this moment of kind of like rising together, this social media candidate and this social media news agency. So Duterte was a funny bloke. He was the mayor of a town in the south of the Philippines, and he was known for his foul mouth. I mean, he would make Donald Trump blush. I mean, really foul mouth. A lot of misogynistic jokes, a lot of dirty jokes. But, his whole thing was he was against the elite. He was against the people in the capital. He was the outsider. He was on social media rather than on TV. And he was really good at clearing up drug crime. That was his big policy. And that's what he'd done in his hometown in quite brutal ways. Cutting a long story short, he wins the election, largely on this kind of like drug crime, busting drug crime, war on drugs policy, but also because he's an outsider and it's kind of an outsider moment. This is just before Trump's election. This is 2016. Duterte is kind of pre-echoes Trump. But once he's in power, he starts doing terrible things. He has vigilantes riding through the streets of Manila, shooting at anybody who happens to live in a slum that looks slightly the wrong way. This is war on drugs. It's just this mass extrajudicial killings. Bodies start to pile up in the slums of Manila. Amnesty International calls it a human rights catastrophe. Thousands are killed. Rappler start writing about it, very bravely, criticizing him. And suddenly their online community, which they'd fostered with such love, starts to change. You have all these kind of weird voices in it going, why are you guys against our president? You guys are traitors. You're fake news. And first they don't pay much attention to it, but it grows, and they can see how the atmosphere in their community is changing. Then all across the internet, they suddenly find their journalists under attack. Really in quite intentional ways, undermining their reputation, calling them foreign agents, smearing them, intimidating them. And it gets pretty bad. There's like hundreds and hundreds of messages coming into their private emails, into their SMSs, just sort of infestation of nastiness and aggression. And it has an effect. You know, as the journalists walk down the street, or in the case of Manila, through the malls, there are no streets in Manila, it's just malls, people start screaming at them. Why are you guys against our president? He's doing such great things. Their advertisers start to retreat. Advertisers are like, we don't want to touch you guys. You guys are like, you're controversial. All gets very, very nasty. They start getting death threats. People on their board start resigning. And then, as is often the case in slightly corrupt countries, they have all these tax cases suddenly opened against them. All of them get thrown out, but that's the way governments often attack independent media in these countries. They find something in the taxes and try to go after that. The media might well find themselves innocent if the courts are just, but there'll be another case and another case and another case, and it's to wear you down, and it's very expensive to go up against in court. Things are reaching a real crisis point, psychologically and also financially. So Maria and her team kind of sit down and it's like, okay, are these all attacks organic? I mean, who's doing this? Why are they so angry at us? And they start kind of deconstructing the lines of attack against them. And the first thing they start thinking about is a bit weird, is that there's all these K-pop, Korean pop stars who are leading the attacks on social media against them. They start phoning up the agents of the Korean pop stars. Like, why are these Korean pop stars attacking, with huge followings? Korean pop stars are big in South Asia, like really big. Why are these Korean pop star accounts attacking us in the Philippines? And it turns out these aren't real accounts. That somebody has engineered these accounts, made them look like Korean pop stars to get lots of following, and then weaponized them against Rappler. That's quite easy to catch. That's a simple fake account to sleuth out. Then there are other accounts who are really leading the charge, coordinating these attacks on them. They seem to be real people. They're not like obvious fake accounts, which say, I don't know, Tom123456 you know that's fake. These are real people who look like real people with real biographies, with real sort of personal biogs and places where they work. But again, they start investigating them. They start phoning up these places of work, and it turns out, no, these people don't actually exist. And it slowly dawns on them that this is actually a coordinated attack. It's not organic. Somebody is doing this and planting this on purpose. And as they dig further and further, they start to look at how these attacks are happening. So you can sort of follow this in internet analytics, and they're not happening slowly the way an organic attack would. They're peaking very fast and stopping, peaking very fast and stopping, which is a sign that somebody's designing them. And then through whistleblowers, through investigations, they kind of work out that there's actually a network of PR companies in and around the president who are doing this on purpose, who are using huge troll farms in order to launch these attacks and discredit Rappler. They're also doing them against opposition politicians. There's a whole bunch of targets they have. So Maria's kind of, I've solved this. I've cracked it. And she first goes to Facebook and says, look, a lot of this stuff is happening on your platform. You guys are responsible. They're like, oh, we'll do something about it. Nothing much gets done. But then she kind of turns to public opinion and says, look, this is a form of censorship. We're under attack. We're being stifled this way. And the spokespeople, of the government, their various outriders in the media, say, no, this is freedom of speech. No one's censoring you. This is more information. You guys wanted more information. You're pro-democracy. We live in a marketplace of ideas. More information means the best information will come to the top. And obviously, this is being said with a lot of cynicism and a kind of a leer to a certain extent. But they're right. You know, as I mentioned previously, there's nothing in the Declaration of Human Rights about disinformation. It's not a category. It doesn't exist. There's no one to sue. You can't take them to court for too much information. So Maria her travails continue. I was meant to appear with her at South by Southwest last week, or the week before last, and she couldn't make it. The government wouldn't let her out of the country. Every time she wants to go outside the Philippines, she needs the government's permission, because she has all these tax cases against her. And in a particularly sadistic way, they gave her the permission 3 hours after her flight had left. They did let her go and receive her Nobel Prize. I suppose that was one step too much for them. But this continues to this day. Nothing's been done about it. But there's something very structural there. You know? Legally, morally, and philosophically, we really have no way to deal with this. So that's the technological bit, which I'll come back to. But I don't think that explains everything. As I mentioned, my first book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, was about Russia. And I already saw a lot of the things that we talked about, especially this idea that truth doesn't matter, that truth has no value, manifests itself there. And even though that process has been made worse by the internet, I already saw it playing out on legacy media. And I think to understand that, we have to marry the technological crisis with a broader kind of political and cultural crisis. So when I was living in Russia between 2001 and 2010, the Kremlin was reorganizing its propaganda. They were moving away from a Soviet model where they try to kind of insist on a higher communist truth. They knew the truth. They would ban any kind of evidence that went against the truth, like arresting my father for books about the prison system. And they would insist that you had to agree with that truth, that the Communist Party was right, that it was leading the country to a better future, that the ideal socialist utopia was around the corner. Now, everyone knew that their truths were lies, and I think that worked against them. You know, there was this credibility gap in all of the late Soviet period between the regime and people's experiences. They knew that they weren't heading to a socialist utopia. So in that competition for truth, they ended up losing. When I lived in Russia, the Kremlin wasn't trying to do truth anymore. They'd inherited this very cynical population. And like all good propagandists, they worked with that cynicism. So instead of saying, we know the highest truth, they just say, no, there is no truth. Everybody's lying. We're lying. The Americans are lying. We do propaganda. The Americans do propaganda. What's the difference? I was there in the aftermath of Iraq. It was a very easy argument to make. So you work with people's cynicisms. You don't try to insist that you know a higher truth. You make them doubt everything. That's the title of my book. Now, I suppose in Russia there were specific reasons why that works so well, but I've seen it rolled out country after country after country. And it makes sense. If you're a propagandist, you can't control the information environment. You can't control it in a democracy. You can't control it in a dictatorship. You can't control it in a democracy. And so you see doubts instead. Every time Donald Trump, and I am taking no position on Donald Trump, whether he's good or bad, I'm just sort of relaying his narrative strategies. He'd do this all the time. It's like, well, I just don't know. You just don't know what happened to Hunter Biden's laptop. Well, you don't know. And that was his favorite, just like, And if you watch Fox News or Kremlin TV channels, it's very, very similar. It's just undermine faith in the other side. often with very good arguments, you know. Watching Kremlin propaganda or Sean Hannity, it's very, very similar. You know, the Kremlin propaganda will undermine your faith in the BBC or CNN, and Sean Hannity will do that to CBS. Often, they don't have to lie. They often do it very well. But the end point is, and here's a better version of how you get to the truth. The conclusion always is, you'll never find the truth. We live in a world where you can trust no one. And what replaces kind of ideology and truth is a conspiratorial worldview. Conspiracy replaces ideology. Yes, there's no clear idea about democratic capitalism or communism. There's no kind of normative debate between big ideas. But there is a conspiratorial worldview. The conspiracy is always changing, both in Russia and in America. You know, here it moves from Pizzagate to QAnon to the election was stolen. It doesn't matter. All that matters is this conspiratorial worldview. In Russia as well, it's constantly moving, constantly developing. The most famous TV show host in Russia, political TV show host in Russia, Dmitry Kiselyov, his catchphrase is, a coincidence? I don't think so. And he'll just take any story and turn it into a conspiracy theory. It's actually quite darkly balletic the way he can do that. And conspiracy theories, in that they replace ideology, serve a lot of its functions. They create group identity, a sense of us versus them. They explain the world in certain ways. They make you feel kind of clever if you're in on the conspiracy. And at the same time, they kind of excuse your own failure, because it's not your fault that you messed up your life, it's the conspiracy. So it has all these very, very functions that ideology may have served before. Now I keep on thinking, why has truth disappeared so effectively in that context? Why did we as audiences give up on the truth and let it be replaced with doubts and conspiracy thinking instead? And I think it might actually be very, very related to a change in the value of truth from the ideologies that we used to debate about in the 20th century and this new world where conspiracy theories have replaced ideology. So what do I mean? Going back to my parents' world, it's a competition between two systems, between democratic capitalism and communism. Each of them is essentially an enlightenment system that is trying to make a claim about the future that they're going to achieve. Yeah? We're going to get to socialist utopia, or we're going to get to globalized capitalism. But they're deeply, at their essence, they claim to be rational systems based on, in communism's case, science, or in the case of democratic capitalism, some sort of idea about a rational enlightenment subject. And they have a place where they're going. And in that system, the truth matters as a value, because you've got to prove that you're getting there. So thus the communists are constantly trying to prove they're achieving their utopia. They lie all the time, but they try to make their lies sound like truth, or have the veneer of truth. They quote statistics about how great the Soviet economic system is, even when it's nonsense. So what am I getting to? That the value of truth in a certain political discourse is tied to an idea of a rational future. As long as you have a rational future you're getting to, you need facts to prove that you're getting there. So in Russia, by the time I'd arrived there, all versions of the future had fallen away. Nobody had really believed in communism the last 20 years, and then any kind of hopes for democratic capitalism had really been destroyed by 1993, which is a pivotal year. And the thing that takes over is doubt, conspiracy thinking to re-explain the world, and the other key thing, nostalgia. Nostalgia starts to dominate Russian political discourse from the mid-90s, and by the 2000s, when I get there, it just floods everything. with the Russian version of Make America Great Again, which is bring Russia off its knees, which is Putin's, one of his main slogans. But that happened in Russia. I can see how the future disappeared in Russia. But I think something similar has been happening here for a lot of people. Maybe not for the people here or in this room, because you're all, very smart and privileged and have a great future, but for the many people who don't. And I think 2008 is a pivotal moment, and the financial crash, and the sense for many, many millions of people in the West that there isn't a bright future for them, and their kids are going to be poorer than them, and they don't have a stake in the happy, globalized future that we kind of grew up with as a given, certainly when I was at university. And it's very interesting seeing how, really from 2008, all these elements that I'd seen in Russia start to appear in propaganda in Western Europe, from the emergence of Orban in Hungary through to all sorts of things happening on the far right in the US. And in my book, I interview these kind of Russian propagandists who helped build the Putin propaganda model, this mix of doubt, conspiracy, and nostalgia. And I was like, it's weird. I now see these things that you guys specialized in Russia happen in the West. And they're like, oh yeah, you guys are catching up with us. We arrived at this point earlier than you did. We lost all of our ideas of the future in the 1990s. Now you're getting there too. Now again, there's many people in the West who don't feel this way. There's many of us who do feel there's a future, and we're happy, and our kids are feeling better, and our kids are going to be, one day not as poor as we are. But after we've paid for their college fees. But that sense of a lack of future has disappeared for many. And it's what unites Duterte, Trump, Orban, Putin, Bolsonaro. Also, they're men of a certain age, which is very important. But they're all nostalgists. So these two things, one of them technological, the other one cultural, political. We could think about how they come together and how they feed into each other. I'll leave you with one little place where I think they do. Because I think these two things are actually feeding each other all the time, and we could think about how they do that. How does the cultural and the political feed the technological and the other way around? But something I noticed in COVID very much, how social media breaks up the sense of time. Yeah? Newspapers gave us a sense of everyday passing. Do you remember newspapers? Some of us do. You got one every day. It said the date on it. It ordered space. Here's the main news. Here's the non-main news. Here's the national. Here's international, but it ordered time. Every day you got it new. You felt you were progressing somewhere. The newspapers would sit, if you had a journalist father like myself, in the corner of the living room and stack up, and they'd turn yellow with time, literally giving you a sense of archaeology of time and politics and meaning. Social media, and it's got much worse in COVID, where I think all of us lost our sense of time entirely, doesn't do that. It sort of reorders things in completely weird ways. You don't know if you're sitting news from 2 years ago, or a week ago, or tomorrow. It's all reordered around yourself, not around a community. So you're just in an endless dialogue with your own narcissism. Aren't we all? So I think that's one of the connecting things. There we see both a cultural crisis around our sense of time and progress in the future, and a technological one. Now, as I talk about time, I'm very conscious of time. How much time do I have left? Because I do want to open it to the floor. Okay, so the solutions in 5 minutes. I like that. So the solutions is what I work on. The book actually parks itself as like, here is the crisis, and then hints at a solution. At the end of the book, I'm sitting in Parliament, because I helped the British Parliament think about our legislation around disinformation. There is no legislation around disinformation. That's how good my help was. But it's sort of book ends with me sort of sitting in Parliament trying to imagine, can democracy rethink its public sphere, where truth matters, where pluralism means better debate, where where self-expression isn't in denial of, doesn't undermine you. So I think there's three things for us to think about, and then we can maybe talk about them. So one of them is, I do think there's a regulatory piece. So I was talking about it with one of the classes earlier today, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. there's a lot of attempts to sort of regulate content on the internet. There's so much disinformation. There's all these attacks on Maria Ressa, for example. We've got to go after every piece of content and take it down. Now, I would love to, when I see my relatives, I'm not going to use the word in-laws, I'm going to use the word relatives, post something really, really stupid about the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, on Facebook, I'd love to call up Facebook and go, my relative has said something wrong and stupid. Can you take it down? Which is what you do with a TV channel. With a regulator, we have regulators around television in England, and you do here as well. They're just not around news, but they do exist. I mean, you can do that. You can make a complaint and the TV channel will do something about it. But the idea that you could regulate pieces of content on the internet when billions are being produced with every, I don't know, is it minute, hour? It's absurd. We're making this mistake of taking our broadcast ideas of content regulation and moving them to the internet. So taking down every time Maria Ressa is attacked and taking down every tweet just will never happen. It's impossible. And I think a blind alley. And a lot of the early legislation around disinformation has been around that. However, we can think about these things as systems. We can think, are the platforms making it easy to create these fake campaigns? Are they making it easy to create a whole network of false accounts that you push this information or disinformation through? We can think about, are there algorithms boosting this sort of content and drowning out others? For that, you need oversight of how the platforms are run. At the moment, they mark their own homework, and that's not good enough. That means understanding how the systems are put together, what safeguards they're taking against these sort of campaigns, and so on and so forth. I think there's a very clean principle that you can apply here, which is actually in line with freedom of expression. Because remember, when Maria Ressa says, I'm under attack, the response is, no, you're not, this is freedom of expression. But freedom of expression isn't just the right to impart information, it's also the right to receive information. And we forget about that bit. And at the moment, I as a citizen, or you as a citizen, when we go online, we don't understand very much about the information that we see. We don't understand who's behind it. We don't understand how much money they've paid for it. We don't understand why it's being targeted at us and not the person next to us. We don't understand how the information is arranged. We don't understand why Facebook shows us one thing and not another. So I'm not a lawyer, as you can probably tell. But I think you can be consistent with the ideals of freedom of expression. You don't have to invent new laws. You can follow these laws to their conclusion and say, we need that information. We're weirdly living, despite the abundance of information, a new kind of censorship where we don't understand how that information is arranged. So that's the regulatory piece. And once you have that oversight, first as a citizen you're more empowered because you'll understand who's trying to influence you and how, so you can respond to it. We can also start putting more norms in place about what we think is legitimate and illegitimate use of technology. So that's the regulatory piece. I'll zip through the other two. The other one is designing new online spaces. So it's bizarre that 3 or 4 social media companies dominate our online space. We should be designing new ones where people do listen to each other, where people can trust each other, where people can find common solutions to things together. The sort of things that de Tocqueville talked about in civil society in America, we need on the internet. We need online spaces where people don't just come together to perform their identity and shitpost against each other, but actually to find solutions. There's lots of examples of this. There's a great system used in Taiwan called Populists, which is the opposite of Facebook. It actually looks for consensus between different groups and finds common solutions to polarizing issues. Now, that's not always great. Sometimes you want to have a fight. Fighting is good. But there are moments when you need that. So it's about having new technology and supporting that new technology. But the reason I used Populists as an example was for something else. How do we return facts and the possibility of collaborative communication to our public sphere. You can do that through better design, but I also think we need a new generation of media whose job it is to get up in the morning and go, how do I reach people who have lost doubt in all types of facts because of propaganda campaigns? How do we penetrate people who believe in conspiracy theories and reach them? And I think that's brought me full circle, because that's what I started talking about right at the start. And that's what we're doing at Arena, and many other people are as well. But that means a real sea change, because that means media that get up in the morning and have that as their mission. And that's nobody's job at the moment. At the moment, your job is to find your audience and polarize the hell out of it. That is what every audience and business consultant will tell you in media. Find your niche, build their identity. Nobody will say it out loud, make them hate the other identity. That's the business logic. And we're completely locked into it. And we've done projects with some of the biggest newspapers in the world who will tell us, we understand what you're trying to do, but we have to follow the ad tech logic. And therefore, the most polarizing content, the one which is most controversial, that beats up on the other political side, is what will help us survive. And we're locked in that. So that'll be a huge sea change, to have a whole kind of generation of civic media whose job it is to do that. 5 minutes, done.
Great, thank you. So, that's loud, geez. Hello, everybody. I'm Jenna Spinelli from the McCourtney Institute. If you are with us in person, if you have a question, raise your hand. Chris will bring the microphone around. We also have a few questions that have come in from our live stream. And I think I'll start with one of those while we're waiting for questions here.
I forgot about my last line. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, please.
No, and sorry, I forgot about this, because I did this whole big spiel about the future and facts. So the essence of this media needs to be based around that. How do we create, sorry, I completely forgot. This is what we're thinking about Arena all the time, and maybe we can engage about this. How do we create context where facts matter again? I'll give you one example. We did a big project in Ukraine, which we're now replicating here before the war in Ukraine. Well, before the latest war in Ukraine. There's been many over the centuries. Where we looked at, I'll just give you one example, historical polarization around history, which in Ukraine is very similar to here. Like, you guys have north-south as your big divide, they have east-west. And it's a very fake divide, as is the north-south one, I think. But it's pushed very hard by propaganda. You know, we have a different history to the guys up there. They don't understand us. They want to pull down our statues. So in eastern Ukraine, it was always, we have Lenin statues. The evil people in the West want to pull down our Lenin statues. Here, it's about Robert E. Lee statues. And it's quite polarized and quite vicious. So we did a lot of thinking in Ukraine and experimenting and working with sociologists and journalists, going, okay, how do you start having a conversation about the past which recognizes all the complexities, but kind of doesn't get people poking each other's eyes out all the time? And the way we found that was to reorientate it towards the future. The moment you start making it less about cultural identity and more about what's the common future, people could agree very fast and people became very fact-driven. So coming back to my point about the future and facts are deeply related. So we'd ask questions like, okay, Soviet Union, a lot of Soviet nostalgists in the eastern part of Ukraine. So we'd ask questions like, yeah, but do you really want to see kind of human rights oppression and gulags in the future? And they'd be like, hell no. We just feel nice about the Soviet Union because, you know, whatever, certain type of ice cream was available then. And they were nice ice cream. It goes deeper than ice creams. But by disassociating cultural biases, which go really deep and are often deeply perverse, from a rational conversation about the future, we suddenly found people like having a perfectly rational conversation about the past, about the past in the context of the future. So what do you want from the past about the future? Suddenly people weren't poking each other's eyes out, they were having a communal discussion. So this question of the future is absolutely key, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
And that actually gets to a question we had come in online about fact checking. So I think in the post 2016 era here in America, we saw organizations crop up to help news consumers in various ways assess, you know, the truth and the facts of the stories and content they were consuming. But it seems, based on what you're saying, that might be ineffective, or I think some of the research may be mixed on that as well. I wonder if you could, or if that is perhaps an example of applying this 20th century framework to a 21st century media environment. I wonder if you could just talk about fact checking and where it fits in this sort of context you've laid out.
So there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that everything we know about how people process information is that they will take on the facts which fit with their worldview and make them feel comfortable, and they will reject facts which don't. And we've seen that in lots of projects that we've done, that we put out lots and lots of facts, even about stuff like sexual health in Eastern Europe, about levels of HIV among young people. People will reject it if it makes them feel uncomfortable, and they'll take it on if it suits their worldview. So, but that's been explored in great detail by something like the Cultural Cognition Project at Yale, which gets into great stuff about how, young white men will reject the evidence around wearing seatbelts because it challenges their identity as people who like to drive cars fast without any seatbelts. But I'll tell you something about fact checking. There's a chapter in my book. It became very small, but it was very meaningful to me. About me going. There's a fact checking global conference every year now. I think I went to the second one. It was in Rome, which is nice. And I went there almost with that satirical hat on. Here's all these nerds, basically, these fact checkers, trying to do something ridiculous, like fight a culture where truth had stopped mattering on a fundamental level with Snopes. And I went there with my cynical hat on and I'll go and laugh at these people. And I got there and I saw something completely different. I saw people often from very dangerous environments. There were a couple there from India and Latin America who reminded me of the image I had of monks in the Middle Ages carrying truth and Aristotle and Greek philosophy in books through the craziness of the medieval era, which might be a cliche about the medieval era, but it's one that's in my head from watching The Name of the Rose. And they were risking their lives with these fact checks. And what they were doing was saying, yes, we live in a post-truth world of Bolsonaros and Modis and all the rest. And by taking a stand about there's a difference between lies and not lies, we're taking a moral stance. And a lot of them were literally risking their lives for fact checks. And I was like, wow, I've got this completely wrong. Quite the opposite. What they're doing is keeping the flame going. And the moral courage of these wonderful nerds was humbling, and I hope that came through in the book.
When you're talking about truth and you're talking about the dissemination of ideas, the existing social media platforms are existentially large now. Now, I don't know how easy it would be to have a competitor, to establish a competitor with the kind of scale that could do that. But I had a question, because recently, you talk about truth. At the a couple of weeks, when was it, a month and a half before the election, the Hunter Biden laptop that you touched on became a fairly big story reported in the New York Post, generally and amplified then by Fox News. The New York Times and the Washington Post and others poo-pooed it, and Twitter and Facebook, both then trying to, I guess, be good citizens, limited the discussion on that topic. And now, here we are 2 years later, and both the Times and the Post, in stories in the past 2 days and a lengthy investigation, as they put it, say that, well, that thing was legitimate. That laptop was legitimate. So the question is, essentially by asking social media platforms to, if you will, police what at one point becomes disinformation or a lie or a conspiracy, in some cases, could it not at some point be the truth?
I'm very glad someone asked that question because it gets into a larger one. So I don't think any of this is about the truth. So when we're talking about the public sphere, which I've invoked a few times, and democratic discourse, when we're trying to kind of burrow through to what it actually means, truth is actually just a symptom rather than a cause. So for us to have a society where we can listen to each other, debate, come to conclusions, accept defeat, make mistakes, move on, this whole kind of like democratic package, which I think is really being challenged in a very concerted way by dictatorships. It's not so much that there's some higher truth that you can always nail. Truth is usually emergent in many ways. Like in this situation, you don't know, then you find out, then you do an investigation, then you change your mind. But it's about having an environment where we trust each other enough, and where I think coming to certain rules of the game is the key. So that story, I think, is a very good example. You have this really genuinely confusing situation. In the wake of what happened in 16, real chance that this evidence had been tampered with. And there was some digital analytics thinking that, yes, it was a real laptop, but it may have been tampered with. And there's this like moment, like, what do we do? So as a society, we need to agree what the rules of the game are. It's much more about agreeing on the rules of the game and saying, these are the rules that we agree on, and how we negotiate things. That's the test for democracy, because there is no ideal solution. And that was a terrible situation. So New York Post put it out. Twitter and Facebook made this completely arbitrary decision to just slap this story and not a million other stories. It looks terrible. It's horrible. So as a society, we need to come to some sort of set of rules that we agree on are the right process for this. That was really an example of a society unable to agree on what the rules are, and then it being left to the social media companies, and they make political decisions based on panic attacks. Largely because they thought Biden would win, I think, and they were worried that they could have harder regulation down the line. That's me being cynical, but have you met Silicon Valley executives? They're pretty cynical. So that's a real, we're in this new environment. We haven't agreed on the rules of the game. And we have these, I think, very, very, very pernicious situations. By the way, I wouldn't have banned the New York Post story. I think, like it or not, New York Post is a legitimate publication. And I think maybe you could have added more information or balance, but not letting them circulate it was bad. That was a bad decision. So that's what's important. And when we think about a public sphere, I think it actually boils down to 2 or 3 really simple things. This is something that I was talking to MIT a lot. They've been thinking a lot about how do you define civic discourse online. How do we know that the conversation is good for democracy? And there's really kind of 3 elements that they came to, and I think I agree with them, which are very simple. One is empathizing with the other and treating the other as a human being, which is much harder to do than to say when all our discourse is around, oh, those liberals over there, oh, those conservatives over there, which is very dehumanizing language. And if I think about whose job it is to mediate that, it's actually culture. Films, movies, storytelling is what will humanize us. Again, it sounds fluffy. It's actually incredibly hard to do. The next one is this rules of the game. What are the rules of something like that? What do we do in a situation where there might be evidence that has been tampered with by a foreign power? What's the process? What's our way of vetting it? How can we all agree this is what we do? And the third one, which I kind of like, I've been hinting at, is for the discourse to go somewhere. It's got to have an effect. We have to have these conversations, and they need to change something in policy and society and so on. That's the kind of ideal that we need to head towards. But I think that's a real symptom. The example you gave is a real symptom of how we're getting it wrong. The truth is going to be emergent. I don't believe in these sort of like shining beacons of truth. It's about trust and talking to each other, and life is really messy and confusing. But we have to maintain an environment where you can make mistakes.
Don't you think a lot of it's media literacy of the user?
No, in the sense that obviously yes, because we're individuals and we have responsibility, but we have agency and we make choices. But it can be hard to be literate about a system that's completely closed. So if I don't understand who is behind what I see online, I can't make a critical judgment on it. I can just stop trusting everyone and become really cynical, but that's actually that becomes a political judgment. And if you listen to Kremlin media or Sean Hannity or someone, they're very good at deconstructing the problems of media. They're very bad at how do we have a civic discourse in this environment. It's very easy for media literacy to become cynicism. You just criticize everything, but you don't learn how to engage with people and to trust them. If anything, the challenge now is how do you get people to trust each other again, not to distrust. So maybe it's an enhanced media literacy, because the media literacy that I had as a kid was like, you watch an advert and you deconstruct it. Like, who put this advert there? Why did they put it there? You know, what does it mean? How is it trying to influence me? That's what we were taught in civics in England. I don't think that's enough anymore. It'd have to be media literacy that teaches you to engage with others and have a conversation where you respect evidence. So I don't think that's done at the moment. Or maybe it is. Maybe media literacy has got better.
Yeah, so we had a question sort of along the solutions line come in online. Do you think a radio free or radio liberty style project could be adopted and applied to the digital information space to combat mis or disinformation, not only abroad, but in the US? So if you wouldn't mind maybe just telling us what radio free and radio liberty are for those who aren't familiar, and then do you think it could apply to the online space?
So in the Cold War, I mean, it's a very interesting history, and actually there's a lot of it in my book, because my father works at Radio Free Europe, so I have a lot of the history of it in the book. But I won't get into the grotty CIA-driven history. But from the 70s and 80s, one of the good things that America does in the Cold War, did a lot of bad things, did some good things too, was kind of support independent journalists from dictatorships. And it gives them, sorry, I'm struggling with this mic. And it sort of creates a bunch of language services in Russian and Ukrainian and Czechoslovak, I think at the time. No, there was a Slovak service and a Czech service, sorry. In all the languages from the sort of countries under Soviet oppression. And it kind of gives jobs to all these exiled journalists and writers, and they can beam back into their own countries. And there really was very little editorial control. So it was funded by the US Congress, but the people running it were often American journalists, and it was, you know, not less independent than the BBC World Service, but clearly with a political agenda. I mean, they weren't doing this to US allies. But beyond that, they kind of let people get on with it. And it was probably quite effective. It's very hard to measure audiences in dictatorships at that point. I mean, they were trying to do polling it's quite clever how they did polling. They'd wait for people to come on like the odd shopping trip to the West. Some people, you know, very controlled groups were allowed out of the Soviet Union to the West. And then they'd sort of approach them in shopping malls and do these kind of on-the-fly surveys, seeing how many had heard of Radio Liberty. That was their way of trying to gauge how many people were listening to it. It's kind of very, very elaborate polling in a way and quite clever. But we know that at the end of the 80s, like something like 30, 40% were. Things were more open by then. It was huge. Really huge. At one point, it was like the most popular stuff inside of the Soviet Union, right at the end. So the more freedom there was, the more people were interested in it. And what it really did do, though, was create the idea of an alternative. I think in that sense, it was definitely important. It said, look, there was an alternative Russia. Russia doesn't have to be that way. It kept the flame going that there could be a democratic Russia. And almost in that realm of ideas, its influence was vast. Because it was exiles. It was people from there. It wasn't like, hi, we're the British telling you the truth. It was like Russians saying, there is a different Russia. One of the sad things was that it was massively defunded after the end of the Cold War. One of the many mistakes that we made. But it's still going. It does exist in a digital sphere. It still has like, I think, 10, 15% of people listen to it. Maybe, I can't remember the figures offhand, but it's still a decent amount, and it's shot up during the war because the remaining Russian independent media has been switched off, and so Radio Liberty always gets a spike at that point. But the problem is slightly that, like all independent media, it's slightly trapped preaching to the converted. That's not trapped, that's just what it is. They did something very clever at one point, and they did a lot of local things, so really local news and bits of Russia, which was very interesting, and they got a lot of trouble for that, and the Russian government stopped that pretty fast. So that was clever, because that tried to really get to the local issues. But it was still about human rights abuse in those issues. So it was like human rights abuse in Siberia, human rights abuse in Dagestan. So it was still kind of for people who cared about human rights abuse. But that was a good move, and the Kremlin stopped that very fast. And now they've been thrown out of the country. But still, the challenge is, like, how do you get beyond that audience who care about human rights? And for that, you have to be much cleverer. I mean, let's take right now in Russia. In Russia, we're all asking the question, what percentage of Russians are for and against the war? And we know, like, the polling is nonsense, but even through more clever polling, which can give you answers without asking people directly about the war, you'll ask them, like, which TV host do you like? And that can be a proxy for, like, where you stand on the war. It's still around, like, 15% are strongly against the war, 10% don't like it but are scared, 20% are just really sad, and 40% are like, yay, let's go kill some Ukrainians. So if you look at that dynamic, which I think a lot of media do, that gives you one map. I wouldn't look at that. I wouldn't be asking that question at all, because I kind of know the answer to that. It's the people who are always liberal, the ones who are against the war. I would be asking the question, or questions around, how do you feel about Russia being isolated from the West? Because that's Putin's big gamble, that Russians will be happy to be isolated. And at the moment, there's obviously a patriotic moment that always happens when a war starts, but 3 months from now, when Russians suddenly realize that not only is Russia not going to the World Cup, they can't watch the World Cup. Now that is going to be a crisis. So I wouldn't even be asking about the war. I know the answer about that. I want to ask about how many Russians are unhappy about isolation. And again, you can't ask that directly, so you'd have to find very clever ways of asking it. And then I think you would find that if 15% are against the war, 50% are upset about isolation, if not more. I think Putin is massively miscalculating and doesn't know his own people, just like he doesn't know Ukrainians. And then I would be thinking, how do you do media for them? But that's not the way, I don't think that's how Radio Free Europe would ever approach it. They'd start off with the current affairs political bit. I'd start off with the big cultural issue. So that would be the limitation.
Okay. I'm gonna have one more question and a shorter answer.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I can do that. I can tweet the answer.
So I have a question about the use of emotion, and to what extent, the media relies increasingly on communicating truth via provoking some kind of emotional experience in either the viewer, the listener, or what have, or the reader. Because a lot of what you're talking about is, when you speak about a pluralistic public sphere, is people presenting ideas, arguments, and debating them and persuading the other person to cognitively change their opinion. But very often, it seems to me, the media increasingly relies on provoking some kind of emotional reaction that is real and true, even by virtue of the fact that a person feels it.
That's a very good point. So, and if I came across that way, then let me elaborate on what I think is a healthy public sphere. So, I really strongly reject this idea that communication is emotion versus rational logos. So this is something that has been passed down to us from Aristotle, and it's really stupid. It's something that could only be come up with by a certain type of emotionally stunted philosopher like Aristotle, and is filtered through academia as some sort of virtue. Now, I mentioned that the base thing for a public sphere is humanizing each other. That's all about emotion. And one of my favorite lessons that I give at Hopkins is showing Diane Arbus's photos, the great photos about the Great Depression, of people suffering the Great Depression, which was sponsored by FDR's government in order to enable the New Deal. And I asked them, is this propaganda or is this communication? What is this? She's plugging into emotion to get you to have sympathy with these people. And for me, that's not propaganda. We can get into what is propaganda, but for me, propaganda is always taking away somebody else's humanity and breaking down the possibility of empathy. I mean, I'm just defining it right now that way. And anything that opens you up to other people's experiences and builds on empathy has a democratic beginning, or makes democracy possible. So yes, I do think the result is parliament and debate and evidence and being able to think collaboratively. But to get to there, it's all about the emotional bit. So that's why I mean culture and movies have, without that foundation, none of the other stuff is possible. So it's the great rivals, the great battle, and this is the great theme of my books, the theme of my books, is not between fact and propaganda and facts and disinformation, it's between art and propaganda. And they're very, very close and incestuous. And the artists will become propagandists the other way around. I mean, what Fox News are thinking like storytellers. Yeah, they're thinking about creating, it's got nothing to do with facts or disinformation, that's tertiary. You know, they're building a very aggressive form of identity, where you're surrounded by enemies, where there's threats, where there's bad guys out there out to get you, and you're on a journey with a superhero Trump who will save you. It's all about storytelling. I mean, it really has very little to do with news. And the only way to compete with that is through storytelling and art, really. To give you a different model of identity, which isn't aggressive, which isn't paranoid, which doesn't reduce the world to these caricatures. Whatever. Putin's doing it now with Zelensky. What is it? The cocaine-sniffing Jewish Nazi. You know, it's like, you know. And Trump's genius, and I use the word genius in a very specific way, was to reduce a complex world to caricature. Little Marco, evil Hillary, very good at that. And we live in a complex world partly because of the information overflow, and so there's this real need for someone who can reduce it to a comic book. And our job is very much to sort of work against that. And that's why I'm less concerned about the truth. The truth is something that will emerge in healthy relationships. So, no, it's art versus propaganda is the great competition. But again, someone's got to be doing that. Someone has to be paying for that. And so, you know, Diane Arbus was sponsored by the government to do that. I'm just not sure whose job it is to do that. That's what worries me. So no, not that. And I'm glad you asked that question, because it's a very important one.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us in person. Thank you to everybody watching online. And don't forget, if you want to hear more from Peter, you can join us in 110 Business Building tomorrow at 3:30 for a lecture on Russian propaganda in war-torn Ukraine. Otherwise, thank you all again, and have a great evening.